time out of your evening, your afternoon. Um, as I said, hi everybody. I'm Dr. Owen Wiseman, so it's really my genuine pleasure to be here tonight, this afternoon, this morning. We are trying to accommodate a lot of time zones today, so wherever it is, we're happy to have you. Now, Nadina invited me here because of our shared passion for really making nature therapy accessible to everyone. We both believe in the really incredible healing power of the great outdoors, whether it's a walk in your local park, hugging a tree, just taking a deep breath of fresh air, which trust me, that's tends to be cheaper than therapy. But on a more serious note, my commitment to exploring nature as an accessible health intervention is both professional and personal, which is again a value that Nadine and I deeply share. So beyond running our own businesses and organizations, we consult for and advise different nature-focused organizations and institutions that help to champion equitable access to nature therapy. We know it's driven by this huge growing body of evidence that supports its benefits. So as such, genuinely, it's an honor to introduce Nadine and her inspiring new book, which I'm hoping most of you are done or close to done. And it really beautifully captures this shared vision. But the big question is, who is Dr. Nadina Hala? So she is a pioneering ecological engineer who has dedicated her career to bridging the gap between nature and technology. She was born in the Netherlands, but raised here in Canada. And her early fascination with the natural world drove her to develop really innovative solutions, I would argue, for creating nature-rich urban environments. So she is, as you know, the founder of the Internet of Nature, which is a global movement that leverages technology to actually enhance urban ecosystems. And with over a decade of academic and entrepreneurial experience, she has really become this leading voice in the field of ecological engineering, as many of you on here are familiar with. You might know her research. You might have heard her tell a story. She's got some great dynamic storytelling, as you read in the book. And it really has inspired many of us on this call to kind of rethink the relationship between cities and nature. Her work's been featured in really prestigious publications, and she does continue to influence urban planning and environmental policy worldwide. So today, as we delve into her new book, The Nature of Our Cities, Harnessing the Power of the Natural World to Survive as a Changing Planet, this groundbreaking work really does explore that symbiotic relationship between technology and between nature. I really enjoyed it because I thought it actually offered a really hopeful vision for the future of our urban environments. So she's going to be shortly reading a passage for us, and then I'll be asking her some questions, picking her brain for a little bit of insight. And then afterwards, what we're going to do is you read in the email, we're going to be putting you all into breakout rooms. And that way you can actually discuss a question that was on your book club guide. And if you don't remember, that's fine because Nadine's going to also be putting it into the chat for you to have a conversation about. So just a gentle reminder that when we're in the breakout rooms, we're really hoping that everyone's going to have a chance to have their say, to share their opinions, share their insight on the book. And then finally, we'll come back together to discuss and close things off. So please join me. You can do the little clap reaction on the video. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nadina, the author of The Nature of Our Cities.
Thanks, Owen, and hi, everybody. So good to see so many familiar faces. I am really excited to kick this off by doing a little reading. And as I said, see some familiar faces. So for Pam and for Zara, who were at the live events, you're going to recognize this reading. The reason why I'm doing it again is it is personally one of my favorite passages in the book. I also think it does a really good job at highlighting and discussing what it is exactly that I hope to achieve with this book, which is seeing nature, urban nature, in a radically different way than we've done previously. So without further ado, I will dive into that. One thing I will say, I know some of you were having trouble accessing the Google form to submit your questions that you might have had about the book. So as I'm reading, I invite you to throw any questions that you had about any part of the book, whether that was writing process, characters, behind the scenes anecdotes, how the book came to be, anything like that. Feel free to drop those in the chat box. And Owen is going to be going through those and moderating as we move into the moderated Q&A portion after the reading. So open invitation to drop those into the chat. And then without further ado, here's a little passage. I'll be reading from page 170 for those of you that have the book in front of you. You're welcome to join me. And if you're driving, please do not. All right, here we go. Come over here. A soft voice calls out. Yes, dear. Here, a little closer. Can you hear me? Standing alone on a street in the neighborhood of Amsterdam North, I swiveled my head, disoriented. I had put on my headphones as I left my house an hour ago, so I should have been prepared for these sounds. But having raced to get here, my mind strayed to the tram chauffeur who had admonished me for getting on at the wrong entrance, to the woman who shook her head at me mournfully after I apologized for bumping into her. Now it seemed I was hearing voices. Then, as I looked up, I was grounded by the sprawling oak before me, its pointed leaves catching the breeze and reflecting ever-changing shadow puppets on the ground. Finally, I remember why I came into this small square, surrounded by misfit houses, some renovated to the T, others neglected for decades, and a glassy branding and design agency that sounded the pitchy trumpet of gentrification. Do you have a second to listen? The voice asked me. This time I nodded, fully aware that I was responding to a tree. Based on her warm, kind voice, I assume the oak's a female, and judging by her large crown and a wide trunk, she's at least half a century old. I'm Mariah, she begins, and I'm so terribly lonely. 2 years ago, I could catch up with my friends on the other side of the street, but now she trails off. Behind Mariah, I see a row of elms neatly planted along the quayside, separated by a busy road. When they expanded the road, Mariah continues, the soil got so compacted underneath that my roots didn't stand a chance of getting through to my friends. Now I'm here all alone. The tree is one of 6 talking trees featured in The Giants of North. It's an immersive geolocated audio tour by theater director Boek van Dijk. In 2019, Boek moved to Amsterdam North, where she was enamored by the neighborhood's people, culture, and original inhabitants. The oaks, ginkgos, elms, maples, chestnuts, and ashes. The product of a nomadic childhood, darting from continent to continent, Boek regretted never staying in one place long enough to know where she truly belonged. When she had a child of her own, Boek wanted stability. She looked to the oldest residents in her neighborhood to establish that sense of place and permanence, her new tree neighbors and the literal roots they'd established over centuries. The 200-foot plants have seen it all. The collision between a Vespa and a Canta, the marital quarrel in the pouring rain, the lost tourist, the cement trucks roaring by, bound for a nearby construction project, their wheels thumping over potholes. Through each monologue, Boek forces you to confront the question. If we listen carefully, what can we learn from those ancient city dwellers we walk past daily without glancing up at their verdant majesty? By taking an interest in these trees, we can foster a deeper appreciation and understanding of the natural world. From marveling at the intricacies of a delicate flower to watching a bustling bird feeder, these small acts can ignite a passion for nature that fuels the desire to protect and preserve it for future generations. Urban nature, which invites us to learn about it, reminds us that regardless of how far we stray from the natural world, we can never fully sever our connection. Early Monday morning, after participating in the Giants of North premiere, I sat down with Boek to discuss her project. She tells me she wanted to be an actress since she was little, until she earned a few gigs and realized that she loved directing theater even more. The immersive experiences a director could create through technology-aided sounds and visuals opened a whole new world for her. She eventually became fascinated by how the same techniques could enhance everyday surroundings to create a unique augmented reality. What if these trees could talk? Boek would ask herself. What would they tell us about the upbringing in Amsterdam's changing northern neighborhood? What would they say about its gentrification, rampant development, and rapid loss of greenery? She had at first tried to understand her new city by interviewing dozens of her human neighbors. A retired bodybuilder who explained how the expansion of the highway through their neighborhood impacted his lungs. A widow who'd missed her daily small talk with neighbors that had been driven out by gentrification. A timid immigrant trying to find his place among the cargo bikes brimming with blonde toddlers. Soon, Book realized that their feelings of concern and disorientation were not unlike those of the trees. Between the rising pollution in the air and soil and the impact of disconnecting urban trees' roots from another, severing their vital nutrient sharing over the wood wide web, the trees that had watched a city rise around them must have felt stunted. Book decided to research their life stories to share them in a new way, a form that they could firmly root her neighbors and herself in the place they'd chosen to call home, to motivate them to preserve it. Like the Victorians who planted trees and landscape romantic fields amid a smoke-clogged London, she hoped that giving the neighborhood's residents a means of connecting to the nature they had could offer a salve for their sometimes challenging lives. The result was Giants of North. What you feel empathy for, Book understood, whether a human, tree, or otherwise, will be what you protect. Mariah, the oak who spoke to me, told the same one that millions of other trees might tell if we gave them the voice to speak. As we have discovered, life on Earth is a gossamer web of fragile relationships that frays exponentially the further we slice into it. As a result of human activity, 1 million species currently struggle at the brink of extinction. Resource exploitation, pollution, invasive species, and most critically, habitat loss are all to blame. As the tree's story reveals, the industrial realities that seem imperative to our way of life amount to a death wish for so many of the organisms that, in the long term, we rely on. Even worse, as the destruction mounts, the species it threatens are growing closer to home. If the dangers of our behavior could be contained to nature while the progress of human civilization marched on like an assembly line, perhaps some of us wouldn't mind. Though our green spaces and animal kingdoms may suffer, those costs could be justified as the price of feeding and housing our growing population or bringing more humans out from the suffering that is poverty. Yet, as we are beginning to discover, the fate of the natural and human worlds lie inseparable. Our disconnection from the landscapes around us isn't only killing nature, it's beginning to kill us. I'm not really a people tree. I'm more of a tree, Mariah told me. What are you doing? A voice behind me cut Mariah off. I gasped softly. I'd been so engrossed in this tree story that I'd forgotten where I was. I turned around and found a girl, about 6 years old, looking up at me. What are you listening to? She asked, pointing at the oversized headphones on my head. I pulled one of them back to hear her better. The tree, I said, laughing. I'm listening to the tree. Trees don't talk, the girl snickered. Oh, yes, they do. I smiled at her. Try this. I kneeled and put the headphones from my head to hers. Realizing they were too big for her small head, I held them in place. I don't hear, she started saying. Give it a second. Her impatience reminded me of my own. I pressed the play button on my phone. Her eyes bulged. Then she swallowed as if trying to digest the shock and wonder streaking across her face. She was nodding now. Yes, I can hear you, she whispered. I let her listen to Mariah's whole story, whose ending I hadn't even heard yet. Seeing the girl nodding intently almost brought me to tears. She shrugged the headphones off and handed them to me. What did you think? I asked. Instead of answering, she ran to Mariah, wrapping her little arms around her trunk. I'm here, Mariah. I'm here. The story of Mariah.
I think we can all probably feel ourselves a little bit in that story, whether it's feeling like we're the tree talking to others and trying to convince them of our value, or seeing ourselves in the little girl who maybe doesn't see nature as clearly as we want to sometimes, but it just takes one moment like this where we really start to notice everything around us. Maybe it's the rain pattering on a roof nearby, or maybe it's a breeze if you have your window open. Maybe it's a window as you're in the car and you can feel the breeze coming in. So what we're going to jump into now is a couple of moderated questions. So, as you know, Nadina had asked you to submit some before today. I will definitely keep an eye on the chat as we're going through, and if we find ourselves with some extra time, we'll try to get to some of the questions that come through. But one of the first questions that we have for you is, what is a piece of advice you'd give to yourself if you were to go through the writing process again? I think it's no small feat to undertake a publication of this size, and of the research that you've done over the years, the travels that you've done, the interviews, the hours of audio that I'm sure you had to comb through and transcribe. So was it what you had expected? How was it different? I think we're all kind of curious about the writing process. As they say, hindsight is 2020.
It definitely is. And it was actually funny enough, one of the first things that I felt after handing in the manuscript, of course you're proud and you're happy that it's done, but the first thing I felt was I would have done that a lot differently, knowing what I know now. And I think a lot of that stems of just never having undertaken a project like this before, right? And I'm coming at this as an urban resident and as a human being first and foremost, but also as an academic. And I think the way that we're taught to write in academia is so completely different from writing stories that are engaging and open and accessible to a general public. So I think looking back, maybe it would have been interesting to follow, some online journalism courses, for example, to really hone into, how do you properly interview someone for a book or for a piece that you're reporting on? I went in all the conversations that you're reading within these pages are me approaching them as just an interested fellow human and asking them questions that I was interested in. And that often meant having to go, as I was working through those interviews and writing them down from the book, often meaning to have to go back several times to these people, fact checking things or maybe asking for additional clarification, just things that after the fact, I was like, I probably could have been a lot more efficient in my interviewing process because I let the conversation very much be guided by personal interest. And then going back on it later, I was like, oh, yeah, maybe I should fact check things here or get more details here. And I think these are just things that you learn and experience, but they're definitely things that I could have told myself. If I could tell myself, that would be one of the things. Um, and the other thing that I would say is that don't try to pre-plan what you think you are going to cover in certain parts. And I think that's maybe something more of us can relate to when it comes to having to write a report for work or a policy document or a strategy or a master plan. I think many of us often before we engage in a project, we already kind of tend to have the outcome in mind. But I would, in retrospect, let myself follow the stories a little bit more in terms of what comes up in the interview process and given myself more time to go into all those different tangents. The beauty of that is that you are able to follow those different tangents. The hard part, of course, is that at some point you do have to draw boundaries over what's going to be in the book and what's outside of the book. And that was really difficult to do in the end. When the publisher said we need 85,000 words, the first thing that goes to your head is, no way am I ever going to be able to write that much. And then weirdly enough, at the end of it, you're cutting complete chapters and stories out of the book. And that was something that definitely surprised me. So in retrospect, I would say, maybe having more experience or following some courses in journalism or reporting could have been helpful. And also letting the story really take you where it wants to go. And that's, I think, something we can all learn from, not being too obsessed with the outcome, the book, and rather let your heart kind of follow where the story takes you.
So when all of you are reading Nadina's second book, when we rejoin here in a couple of years, then look for those efficiencies and those hindsights that she's looked
Oh
back
yeah.
for.
Oh yeah. It will be hyper efficient.
Hyper efficient. Yeah, it was good. Nature's great. One of the things actually, I think someone's question in the chat actually lends itself very, very well here too. So Liz was just saying, there was a line that you had written, what you feel empathy for will be what you protect, and how that really resonated with her. And so Liz was asking about the role you think storytelling plays in all of this. Were there any kind of great examples of tech-powered storytelling you discovered that didn't make it into the book? So maybe we can kind of keep that second piece for later. But the storytelling, I think you spoke to that a little bit, that you surprised yourself with how you approached these interviews.
Definitely. So in terms of sorry, so the questions in terms of what didn't make it into the book?
Or what she's curious about kind of the role that storytelling had played in all of this, and that
Oh,
genuine kind
okay.
of human person to person interaction I think you spoke of just briefly there.
Yeah, um I think when I set out to write a book, I didn't think it was going to be as dialogue heavy as it became. I didn't think it was going to be written as much like a fiction or as a novel than it ultimately did. And I think that's really now one of the big strengths of the book is that it is so dialogue heavy because I think that just it draws people in. It makes people feel like as if they were right there with me. And there's something something about dialogue that makes you really feel like you are part of the story. So that I would say was a huge lesson that I learned in terms of something that worked really well, and definitely something I'd want to take forward, even in like smaller writing projects, even when it comes to writing success stories of what certain cities have done, or even blog posts or columns. Just the more dialogue I feel like we can bring in, the more engaging, the more you're able to draw people in. So that I would say was probably the number one kind of interesting lesson that I learned within storytelling, and also in terms of the writing style as well.
Brilliant. Well, that actually, you kind of said about how cities are doing things, and you briefly mentioned that too. So I think the second question that came through was, how long on average have you seen it take to convince your average municipality, your average local city to incorporate, the technologies, the sensors that's in the beginning of the book, in case you haven't gotten there yet, to help preserve their trees and their landscape. So one of the things is, do you find larger cities that tend to have more resources are more apt to incorporate them given budgets? Because, obviously, unfortunately, everything does come down to that. Yeah, so if we can start with that.
Yeah, the answer to that is so varying, I think, and it ultimately comes down to, and maybe some of you will recognize this as being in that role themselves. I call them the cheerleaders within certain organizations, whether that's a landscaping company, whether that's a green services company, whether that's a municipality. It's often about identifying who are the cheerleaders that are also the decision makers or close to the decision makers that you can have conversations with, you can get them really excited, you can give them the data and the tools that they need so that they have the best arguments in place to go convince the people that they need to convince. And that process can take weeks, months, or it can take like half a decade. Like I've seen it on both sides of things. So for example, in the case of Maastricht, which the book starts with, that was a pretty easy sell, if you will, because it was within a, as you read in the book, it was within a really a summer that the key arborist who was in charge of that massive greening project saw how well sensors worked. And he was able to see immediately, and he was able to see the dollar bills in front of his eyes. This is not just disappointing because of the amount of trees that I've lost and the intrinsic loss that that has, but also how much money we've been wasting at replacing trees that wouldn't have needed to be replaced if we'd had sensors earlier. And then when you stack up the cost of replacing and maintaining new trees versus having to, buy a couple of soil sensors, I mean, that in itself is a really easy financial argument. But if you look at the city of Boston, for example, which comes up later in the book, having them, the fact that they didn't have a working tree inventory, it was really just 2 years ago, if I'm correct, and maybe someone from Boston, city of Boston, will correct me on this, but it was only 2 years ago that the city of Boston finally came out and said, okay, we have this huge urban forestry master plan that we are investing in. And a large part of that is having all of our trees be mapped and having a really good tree inventory in place. So this was something that the city struggled with for years. And there was, not just within the urban forestry department, but residents and citizens and other policymakers from other departments were saying for, I mean, upwards of a decade, this is not working. And then it finally was resolved. So it really depends on who do you have within those organizations, who are your cheerleaders. And I would encourage all of you to identify who the cheerleaders are in either your organization, or perhaps you could become the cheerleader in your own organization, or who they are in the organization or the department that you're trying to convince.
Was just about to say, yeah, we can all become cheerleaders. I know I've met with our own city leaders as well, and it's a slow thing. Government moves very slowly, but become the cheerleader, and you can just be that voice to help convince others too. So that lends itself to where, and you can talk as much about it as you want, but how have you seen cities subsidize or gain additional funding methods to support the cost of the tech of the sensors? Because if I'm a municipality that's really, really interested in it, but I do not have the budget for it in the city planning, how do I go about potentially gathering more? Because I think that would be really valuable for everybody on the call.
I think the sensors are interesting because the sensors is not oftentimes when a municipality wants to plant a new grove of trees, they're hiring a contractor to do so. And typically those contractors have a mandate to keep those trees alive for a minimum anywhere between 2 to 5 years. So that's often the mandate that they have to follow. If those trees are not alive in that 5 or 3 or 2 year period, they're mandated to then replace these trees. So as the original experience or story that I was telling you guys about, that is like a key easy argument to make for a contractor actually to invest in the sensors, not for the municipality, but for the contractor to invest in sensors, because they're actually helping them do their job. They're actually helping them save money down the line because they're mandated to do this anyways. So that's been a really easy way, like the moisture sensors. And of course, I mean, I talk about water moisture, soil moisture sensors in the book. One of the stories that was cut was this much more in detail part about these soil sensors and what they're also able to measure in terms of soil life and soil biodiversity, which is really, really interesting. Although I do feel it's quite early days for the technology and the use case, but it was really interesting as well. Soil moisture is just such an easy thing for the majority of people to grasp, and then to say, installing these sensors costs this much money, it's saving me this many trees. If I weren't saving these trees, I have to replace them, that costs this much. It's a game changer. That's so easy. Something that's a little bit more difficult, but I think has really helped, is like the case of the New York City tree census, for example. And again, this comes back to, why is having a tree inventory so important? You can't possibly start to quantify the benefits of your urban forest in monetary means without first having that foundation of, well, how many trees do we have? What species are they? How large are they? What kind of condition are they in? What is their age? All of these different things. You need that information to be able to quantify any of those monetary benefits. That then those numbers, that's what gets the other non-urban forests, non-arborists really excited, right? Because now we're speaking language that they can understand. We're talking about public health benefits, lowering electricity costs or heating costs in the winter. These are things that they can understand, and that makes the argument a lot easier for them too, because they're not just seeing green infrastructure trees as a nuisance, but something that's actually going to save them money and stress down the line as well.
That again, I think you just kind of, they naturally feed into each other here.
Oh, good.
One of the things many of us are sitting on here is we probably have kind of an idea of a technology that we're really keen on. And I mean, there's lots of that shiny object, and we hear about technologies and then we don't hear about them again, the rise and fall. So I think in your preparation for the book, in your interviews, in your travels, what tech or innovation, and maybe it's a new one that you've read about since you've published it, but what tech or innovation really excites you the most?
No, that's a tough one. I'll talk about one that's in the book, and then I can also talk about one that didn't make it into the book. The one that's in the book that excites me the most is the technology that, I think it's chapter 2. It's saving trees on the paper trail. That the chapter ends with this idea of using LiDAR technology, specifically like how the city of Woerden outside of Amsterdam did it, where they're basically changing the game in terms of how we measure the success of our urban forest, which has so long been measured in terms of, well, how many stems did we plant and how many stems did we remove this past year? And that, of course, gives you a completely unrealistic look of how much biomass was actually lost or gained, but typically lost in said year. When we're using a technology like LiDAR, which is giving you this 3D model of your trees around you and able to measure for the first time, I would say, in an objective way, the crown volume that we have at the street level, the size of the canopy. If we're able to incentivize canopy growth year over year, you've completely changed the way that we measure the success of urban forestry. Now we're not just looking at, basic tree accounting, how many trees gained, how many trees lost. We're actually looking, how much more carbon sequestration potential do we have this year? How many more public health benefits? How many lives are we saving this year? How many years are we adding to people's longevity in this neighborhood? How many cases of depression are we reducing because of the growth in tree canopy over here? That's a completely different way of looking at it. And I think that really changes because it makes it so much more accessible to people that aren't urban foresters and that aren't arborists, that aren't tree accountants, if you will. So that's what really excites me, not just because the technology is cool, and it is, and we can go into why it's so cool, but I think the use case for it is so inspiring. And most importantly, I would say it's something that's so replicable. And we're seeing what's called smart tree inventories, the use of LiDAR to measure trees in our urban forests. we're seeing that being taken off all over the world. I mean, Singapore is sure it's a front runner, but we're seeing this happening now in New York, across Europe, and many different cities across the US and Canada are now experimenting with this technology. So it's replicable, it's cost effective, and I think it's really going to change, again, how we measure the success of the urban forest.
On the flip side, though, what technology scares you the most?
Oh, yes. And before I answer that, Owen, I forgot to mention I didn't say which technology excites me that didn't make it into the book.
Oh, yes, yes.
And I had written a part about it and we ended up cutting it because we felt like it was still so new that and that was a as you'll notice throughout the book, or at least I hope you notice this, all of the technologies that I talk about, I wanted there to be a really strong use case already. I didn't want to theorize or philosophize too much into the future of things that we could potentially do if only we had this, this, and this. I really wanted to be people could read this and there would be things in there that they could adopt immediately. And one of the things that I feel like didn't meet that mark was virtual reality. And virtual reality through the use of there's an ecologist named Ash Welch at AECOM, one of the largest engineering firms in the world. He is an ecologist and a biodiversity specialist, and he was using virtual reality for many years to basically convince property developers that they should invest in nature-based, nature-exclusive design. So he would take property developers, property investors, he would take them to AECOM's office, he would put VR goggles onto them and let them roam around these designs that him and his team had visualized and designed as a way for them basically to invest in it. And as much as the property developers love this kind of out of the box way of looking at, something that they were developing anyways, ultimately it didn't work that well because there weren't, as we were saying here with LiDAR and tree inventories and sensors, the cold, hard facts of what is this adding to my development weren't there. It wasn't there in terms of monetary value. It wasn't there in terms of data. It wasn't there in terms of public health benefits like these other technologies were. And that was really to the detriment. So basically, the property developers would go in, they'd look at this beautiful thing. They were super inspired, but if they weren't intrinsically designed, if they weren't a cheerleader, if you will, they weren't necessarily going to change their design. And that was one of the reasons why why Ash is not using that technology as much as he once did, and why it didn't make it into the book either. Um, Technology that scares me, honestly, now since becoming a new mom, is anything that has to do with kids. So, as you guys know, in the last chapter of the book, Raising Future Naturalists, I talk about these different technologies that can help kids, teenagers, youth, kids, explore their outdoors. And I think there's some beautiful examples in here, like City Nature Challenge, for example, something that's very family friendly. It's this 4-day period, it's this competition. You're really using the technology as a tool, right? You're in nature, you're doing your thing, but the technology is simply a tool to log what you see, identify what you see, and to send it to iNaturalist and send it to the challenge. But there are other things I talk about, like the mobile augmented reality games, for example. And the mobile augmented reality games, I'm of two sides. On the one hand, I'm like, look, if this is going to get a kid that normally would never be outside, that would never be outdoors, if this is what it's going to take, and I didn't mention them in the book, but there's another great US based tool called Agents of Discovery. They've created all of these mobile augmented reality games that have biodiversity hotspots and geolocated hotspots based in a lot of American national parks. If that's going to get kids and youth that normally would not be outdoors and would not be interested or learning about nature, that's going to get them there, then yeah, I'm all for it, right? Like Richard Louv says at the end of the book, the technology is as good as long as it doesn't detract or distract from being outside. So I think that's really what I keep in the back of my head. As long as it doesn't, reach that threshold, I'm happy. But I think there's something to be said, if the only, if you're outside but your face is glued to a screen, then I'm like, yeah, what have we really gained here? So that's something that I think it's a really fine line, and I think it's ultimately to each parent and each educator and each caregiver to look at really critically and think really critically. Is this adding to the experience or is it hurting the experience? And this is not rocket science. I think we know as parents, as caregivers, as educators, I think you can know quite quickly whether it's adding or whether it's hurting.
And I think that's something probably a lot of us can relate to on here. If we are parents, if we have nieces, if we have nephews, is where the decisions that all of us, because we're in the industry and we're making today, or we have an interest, maybe we're not even in the industry, is we are doing it for the next generation and for those who will inherit the planet from us. So that makes me wonder, why did you pick the title The Nature of Our Cities? And I imagine when they're coming back and saying we need 85,000 words, and you're trying to figure out, okay, out of these 10 titles I like, this was the one I settled on. What's that like? What's the process like?
I didn't pick the title. The publisher chose the title. I wanted to call the book Internet of Nature, and the publisher said hard no. And I tried for many months to get them to consider it, and they were like, it's too, what does that mean to the odd person? And it took me a long time to come around to the nature of our cities, if I'm being honest, because I was so stuck on it. And I had a bunch of other cool titles. Like I really, for a while, I really wanted to call the book How to Talk to Trees on the Internet and other cool ways technology is helping us connect to nature. And the publisher was like, no, that's not going to sell any copies. So I had a lot of funky ideas. Many of them I still think are phenomenal. The publisher did not feel the same way. And ultimately, I have to say, like seeing it here and having it be the nature of our cities, it's when I'm at a hair appointment or I'm in the back of an Uber or what have you, right? You're talking to someone who is so far removed from this, and oh, what do you do? Oh, well, I just came out with a book. And I tell them this is what it's called. I don't even have to do the elevator pitch. It is immediately clear what the book is about. It's got like this really beautiful double meaning. And I've ultimately like really, really grown to love it. And clearly HarperCollins knew what they were talking about because I think the title has really resonated. So yeah, that's the story behind the nature of our cities.
You all know on this call the secret behind the scenes that Nadina did not, in fact, choose that title.
No.
As we are going through, we're kind of hitting a point now too where we definitely want to make sure that there's time to have a conversation in the breakout rooms amongst yourselves. That's a big part of tonight. And one thing that's really great with the book club is fostering this sense of community of like-minded folks. I know for Nadine and I, anytime we meet a fellow nature nerd, we're sitting there and going, yes, okay, one more cheerleader that's out there. So what we'll do is Nadine is going to share the question again. The one that we want you to contemplate is actually question 20 on the book guide, if you are familiar with it. So we'll put that out. We'll stick you into your breakout rooms. You can have a conversation amongst yourselves. And after about 5 to 10 minutes, somewhere in there, we'll bring you all back, and then we can wrap things up as well. So I have noted down there's a couple of questions in the chat. Don't worry, I'm not going to miss those. And we'll see y'all when you do get back. So take a peek at the chat because that question will be coming through.
Great. So here it is.
So,
Obviously, you're going to lose access to this chat when I put you in the breakout room. So this is question 20 from your book club guide, which you should all have as a PDF. The question is, reflecting on the book's exploration of nature within urban settings, how has it influenced your perception of nature in cities? Can you recall specific examples or experiences from the book that resonated with you and contributed to your changed perspective? How do you now envision urban nature, sight, sound, sense, and what aspects do you find most compelling? So this is, again, really about how has the book changed your perception of urban nature? So keep that in the back of your mind. Again, it's question 20 from your book club guide. So without further ado, I will put you into your breakout rooms.
hang on, welcome back. Welcome back.
Welcome
So
back.
what we're going to do actually with a little bit of the time, Nadine and I were chatting and being part of this group, we thought if you have your book, don't worry, we won't bug you if you don't have your book, and you're okay with having your photo taken, then we just ask you can hold up your book. We'll take a little screenshot. Do not feel obligated if you're not comfortable. You can just flip down your camera so you don't appear on it. Yeah, just a good way to feel connected to the book as well.
Oh,
Oh,
I
and if
love
you have
it.
an audiobook, yeah, you can't really show that either.
I'm gonna hide non-videos. Okay, perfect. Yay! Oh, this is so cool. Oh, thanks, Lori. I like the creativity.
Thank you, everybody. Photo's been taken there.
Thanks, Owen.
So as we come back in, I did say we did have a couple other questions. They were really around kind of how would you kind of convince people to actually take on the Internet of Nature and recognize its intrinsic value and really convince the policymakers, the decision makers. We're all boots on the ground trying to really get people excited about it, but ultimately it's them that we need to convince with their cheerleading as well. So one of the things is in the book, in the group, we'll be able to delve into that conversation a little bit deeper as well, just kind of being mindful of time today as well. So, Nadine, as we kind of look at wrapping up today, um, is anyone kind of comfortable sharing what they had a dialogue about, or is there anything you're curious to know from everybody?
Yeah, I'd love to know, is anyone immediately off the get-go willing to share, or else I'm just going to pick on someone.
I saw David raise a hand.
Yeah, if I can go ahead, can you hear me?
We can hear you, David. Thank you.
Yeah, just tuning in from Sydney down under, but I've just been at a Greening Cities conference 2 weeks ago in Melbourne. And Nadina, congratulations on the book. I just randomly opened it up one day and it fell out on that whole thing about Melbourne's urban forest and people sending love letters. And I know that one of my breakout companions, that was what he was talking about. So
Oh,
that's
cool.
been fantastic. But at the Greening Cities conference, I think the urgency of what we've got to do is a big issue. And I think the capture of the data set, I know we're also putting a letter in. We've developed a national urban green infrastructure handbook. I think I mentioned that to you in a LinkedIn message, Nadina. The other exciting thing is that this week, 7 organisations in the urban green infrastructure sector are sending a letter to the National Infrastructure Minister to develop a national urban green infrastructure strategy, to look at asset class recognition, and to start dealing with what I like you talking about, being an accountant of trees, but also that we want green infrastructure in Australia to be treated and funded the same way as grey infrastructure. And you would know as an engineer that having that data set and the business case is so important. And we were talking last week in Melbourne about the importance of now in the metropolitan planning for each city and at the national level, having the right benchmarks and metrics, whether it's canopy, whether it's urban heat problems, whether it's obesogenic data sets of obesity, and where we know that people are using cars for short-term travel, is all of these co-benefit layers must be put into strategic planning. So this is where the smart city and the sensors and the LiDAR, and there's been some challenges, I know, just within Melbourne, getting that data set recorded every year consistently using the same methodology.
Yeah,
But I
and
think
having it have the
this
same
accounting,
gravitas as grey
yeah.
infrastructure. Yeah, I think that's really, really
So
critical.
it's learning to make the business case as if you were pitching for a big grey infrastructure project.
Absolutely.
So it's
Absolutely.
shifting the language, and this is where the handbook that came out last year with Standards Australia is trying to get. It's aimed at planners, engineers, and policy people. So there's no confusion about what we're talking about with urban green infrastructure, because we'll have
Very good.
confusion around urban forests and green grids, and we're saying, well, they're both generic forms of urban green infrastructure strategy. So language, the data sets, and trying to talk up what we do, like we are grey infrastructure advocates, I think is key. And I love your term.
Yeah.
We need more tree accountants out there.
Absolutely. Speaking that common language, I think, is critical.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Was there any last thoughts, a quick thought that someone had in the breakout room that they'd be willing to share based on the question number 20 that was posed to you?
Hi, I'll make a comment. So my
Thanks,
my
Deborah.
group, I'm Deborah. So I'm a student at ECU, and so my group what were instructors. They have students, and so I thought that was good that they want to share the knowledge that they have learned from the book with their students and anyone else. And so with me, I will be sharing it with my fellow students. Uh, we just got out of ecological planning, and so I used the book for my paper that we had to write. And the things that we didn't know the extent of the fire, what fire means. And I guess you covered it in 3 chapters. And then I didn't know about the tree inventories, how intense that was. So that was really helpful as well.
Oh, good. I'm
I
so
would
glad to
echo
hear
you,
it.
Deborah. The first time I heard the term gigafire was in this book. I'd never heard of that before.
Yeah, scary stuff. And to your point, Deborah, it's great to hear that you'll be sharing it with other students and for any educators out there. I'm actually working with HarperCollins to try and get free copies, at least sample chapters, and hopefully copies of the whole book to educators, both at the college and university level. So, in high schools, ideally, would be my dream. But so fingers crossed, that's in the works. All right, Owen, I'll pass it over to you to close us off.
Yeah, so I mean, again, as we kind of recognized at the beginning, we have people all across the world in multiple different time zones. So I think on behalf of Nadina, I mean, we really recognize that you've taken time out of your day. You could have been anywhere. You chose to be here with us, which is we're very grateful for as well. I'm grateful to be here to interview her once more on her book. We did have a live launch event a couple of days after it went live, so that was quite exciting too. One thing I'd encourage you is if you haven't finished the book, there's lots of great information that's ahead of you. So you've kind of heard some snippets of stories. You have a lot to look forward to. And as we've mentioned multiple times here, be a cheerleader. Don't be afraid, right? Email your counselor, email your municipal leader, your decision maker, your cheerleader, and get them on board. Because at the end of the day, we have one planet. We've all heard that line before. There is no planet B. So we really need to make sure that we're looking after it, we're recognizing it, helping quantify it, developing metrics, as David talked to his point with gray infrastructure as well. So get excited about it. And that was one thing I found with this book in a real nutshell is you're so used to hearing really depressing things. The book I read before this was horrific. And I felt awful reading it because it's just doom and gloom. Sort of read Nadina's book, The Nature of Cities, where there was hope in every single chapter. I really truly think that it's something that resonated with all of us, hence why we're here. So thank you on behalf of everybody, Tina, for just writing it and spending the time putting it all together.
Thank you so much, Owen, for being here and for being another fabulous co-host another time around. And I'll just share 3 quick points. If you're interested in supporting the book any further, and you guys have all gone above and beyond to do so, 3 points would be to please share the book with a friend or colleague, as Deborah mentioned. 2, to please call your local library and request it. I think Lori just mentioned this. Call your local library and request they order it in. That's a huge help. And 3rd, I've been saying this in my emails. I know some of you already have, but even if you didn't order the book on Amazon, leaving a review on Amazon is so incredibly helpful. It pushes the algorithm, gets more eyeballs on it, and it really, really helps me out. So with that, thank you so much for being here. Wish you all a lovely evening, afternoon, day ahead of you. And thank you so much for supporting the nature of our cities.